In this lecture, I'm going to wrap up what you've been learning about qualitative designs and give you some ideas for evaluating what you see. When you're evaluating qualitative research, there's really three things that help you. You need to look at the reflexivity, and that involves the role of the researcher. You need to look at extensions of the research and then always keep in the front of your mind some ethical considerations. First of all, let me talk about what reflexivity is. Reflexivity refers to how the actual researcher or researchers impact the data, the findings, the interpretations. You can never take the researcher out of a qualitative study. And researchers always have personal interests, agendas, biases, etc., that provide a lens through which the data is gathered. A good researcher, however, will find a way to balance this. Some use a peer debriefer or someone who can act as a sounding board and question what is described. A field log is critical with all of the details. Even though things are being recorded, a qualitative researcher has to be noting what they see as it happens in the classroom. And a journal. Most qualitative researchers who are worth their salt keep a reflective journal that lets them describe the process and the findings as you gather the data and your thoughts on it, and what's kind of bubbling up and emerging in the questions that you have, and then you dig into the literature and find what's happening as you're researching. Researchers often have an agenda, and so it's really important that he or she acknowledges their passions and their interests and the previous research they've done in this field, all of those sorts of things. Really good qualitative research is done with such good records that someone else could go through and actually audit them and practice coding them and see whether they agree or not with the coding that's been done. And based on the findings and interpretations and all of this rich pile of data that you've got. And finally, the researcher tries to corroborate with what others find. And so you're always substantiating some other theory or a framework or what's been done or refuting it. Now, our knowledge of how people learn is additive. In other words, it grows with every bit of research that's added. So, if qualitative research is authentic and actually represents what participants have experienced, there are two questions that can just logically be asked. First of all, can this research be duplicated, or could we do the same thing in a similar setting? And second, what are the next things that we should look at then after we found out this? What are the next logical steps as we try to understand this facet of learning? And this is what we call extending the research. Qualitative research just lends itself so well to, oh my gosh, here's what I want to find out next, or here's where I want to go. And the researcher, if the design is good and the sample size is appropriate, or the sample is appropriate, there's just some ways to strengthen this extension of the information. First of all, looking at the researcher role. I know I've said that over and over again, but I just can't emphasize how important it is. And then you need to look at whether the sampling and the typicality, was the sampling done because we wanted to see unique cases, or did we want to see can we extend it because this sample was typical enough? Of course, the context is really critical. If you're going to look at a third grade classroom, it would then be a wonderful extension to go ahead and look at a fourth grade classroom or to compare them. But that context has to be considered. If you're going to extend the research or try and see if it would work in another setting or if another setting was similar, you've got to understand the data analysis strategies that were used and look at the detailed narrative so that you can find another context that's very similar. And of course, you're always staying within a theoretical framework and some analytical premises or assumptions that are made as they go along. And then, as I've said before, one of the most powerful pieces of being able to extend qualitative research and see if it applies in another situation is that it uses all these rich alternative explanations and intertwines them together. As you build trust and relationships with subjects in qualitative research, you can get into some really sticky spots and must be careful. For example, in one of my observations as part of a project last year, I had a teacher confide how discouraged and frustrated she was with the inconsistent rules that were being or weren't being applied across the school. It appeared to this teacher that some colleagues were ignoring the procedures that all the staff had developed for when students misbehaved in a particular setting. And so the kids were using iPads. Again, this is back to my iPad example. So as a result, this teacher confided that at least half the staff had stopped having the students use the iPads in their classroom, but they hadn't spoken up. There was this quiet barrier being put up to the students using their iPads because, at least in the lens this teacher was interpreting things through, there was inconsistency for the rules, and it was very frustrating to her. So here I'm supposed to be an observer using this technology integration matrix observation protocol, but the teacher has confided in me, and this confidence the teacher shared did affect the classroom culture. What in the world was I supposed to do? This is the kind of ethical dilemma that a qualitative researcher can quickly find themselves self in, and so that trust and relationship could be abused. There are obviously situations where a qualitative researcher may get information that could be harmful to a student or about a student being harmed. There always this ethical situations that you can find yourself in. Do you just let the teacher vent? Do you share this information with the principal? All of those become very, very difficult questions to answer. It's not cut and dry. And it's unbelievable the kinds of dilemmas that just can pop up. So you're constantly negotiating ethics and ethical situations. Keep in mind that we always use informed consent, unless it's some kind of mandated thing we're within a school district project. But you always want your subjects to know what's going on and why they're being observed at the very least. You have to respect the confidentiality and anonymity as you report this. We use pseudonyms for children. We give them names that have nothing to do with their names, so that they could never be identified by a casual observer. We have to respect the subject's privacy and reach out to them in a sense of fairness about this. Very often in my role with the school district, I'm doing classroom observations that should have absolutely nothing to do with the teacher's evaluation, for example. I'm not the teacher's supervisor. So I have to reach out to that teacher with fairness, and they have to know why I'm in their classroom and what data I'm gathering, and feel confident that I'm going to keep that at a level that's not going to be used in any way for their evaluation. And that's another ethical dilemma that I often face in my role. Because quite honestly, sad but true, every once in a while you run across a classroom where it's so difficult as a researcher, where you just want to sit down with the principal and say, oh my gosh, this teacher needs help. These students need somebody to intervene in here and get some help. This is what's happened. And you can't do that. If that's not your role, if you're truly just observing and gathering the research, then that wouldn't be fair to the participants. Now, last but not least, when you're evaluating these qualitative research articles that you'll come across, there are some things that you can systematically look through. And I'd like to suggest that you use this almost as a checklist when you're reading and evaluating, so that you address each of these in your critique of an article, for example. First and foremost, you need to look at the kind of research question that's being asked. If the research question is something that lends itself well to a quantitative research design, then that's what should be used. A person shouldn't try to answer a quantitative type of research question with qualitative research just because it's seen as easier or more convenient. That's not the point. The point is to choose the research method that's going to actually give them the richest and most accessible data. I'm going to go down this checklist with you. Look at the researcher. What's the background, the interest, the bias? And if the researcher pretends there isn't any, or leaves that completely out of the article, that should be an alarm bell going off. Look at what framework the researcher references. If you come across an article where there's no framework given, that also should be a red flag that this person may just have gone out and started doing observations and gathering data, but they're not couching it in something systematically. Look at the sampling. And as I said before, if it appears that the researcher just grabbed a classroom because it was convenient, there was not enough thought went into how the sample needs to relate to the question that's being answered. Researcher role. Again, researcher role. That researcher plays a role whether they acknowledge it or not. And if they're not acknowledging that, proceed with caution. Look at how the researcher describes the data collection. And remember, you want different types of data collection. It shouldn't all just be a bunch of classroom observations or a bunch of interviews. And then did that researcher talk any about the training or the observer inter-rater reliability or anything at all like that happened, and the procedures for coding all of this stuff? Look through all of this for a general sense of credibility. Is what is being described makes sense with what's being interpreted? And there should be a good, clear description of what's happening separate from the interpretation. This is what I saw. This is what I think are the reasons or why it happened that way. And here's why I think it happened that way. And then be really, really critical of short duration qualitative research. Went in the classroom once and observed this, or went in for 15 minutes one time, or 3 classrooms for 15 minutes. All of those are red flags as you evaluate qualitative research.